The wind came down from the high country like a knife, howling through the pines and rattling the shutters of the cabin that clung stubbornly to the side of the Sierra Madre foothills. Snow drove in hard sheets, hissing against the logs, piling high against the doorway until the shape of the little home looked more like a mound of white than a shelter built by human hands. Inside, the fire cracked and spat, casting long shadows across the single-room cabin. A rifle leaned against the wall within easy reach. A set of traps hung near the door, crusted with old rust and frozen blood, and in the center of it all sat Elias McGraw, hunched over a rough-hewn table mending the edge of a buckskin coat by lantern light. Elias was not a young man. His hair, once black as coal, had gone silver long ago. His beard was thick, flecked with ice from his breath, and his shoulders, though still broad, carried the heavy stoop of years spent alone beneath the weight of his own ghosts. The skin of his face was weathered and creased, a map of lines carved by wind, sun, and sorrow. 30 winters he had lived in these mountains, each one harder than the last. 30 winters since he'd left behind the wide plains, and the town where his family had been cut down by outlaws with no names worth remembering. 30 winters since he'd traded the company of men for the silence of the high wilderness, where no law existed but survival and no sound but the cry of wolves at night. He preferred it that way, or so he told himself. The blizzard outside roared louder, and Elias set down his needle, flexing fingers stiff from cold. He rose, joints creaking, and moved to the fire to toss another log onto the flames. Sparks leapt up like fireflies before dying in the smoke-blackened chimney. For a long moment he stared into the flames, lost in thought. That was when he heard it, a sound, faint, muffled by the storm. A sound that did not belong to wind or wolf. At first he thought it a trick of the gale, but then it came again, a knock. 3 soft raps on the cabin door. Elias froze, every muscle tight. He had lived long enough in the wilderness to know that strangers rarely came bearing good intentions. Out here, uninvited visitors meant trouble 9 times out of 10, and death the other one. His hand slid instinctively to the rifle prop by the wall. He lifted it, cocking back the hammer with a sharp click that sounded loud in the silence. The knock came again, this time more urgent. Slowly, Elias crossed the room, rifle raised. He pressed one ear to the heavy log door. Over the wind he heard something strange, voices, women's voices, faint, broken, carrying the sound of desperation. Help, one called, so softly he almost thought it the storm playing tricks. His brow furrowed. He pulled back the latch, cracked the door open just enough to peer into the white fury outside. What he saw stopped him cold. Huddled against the snowdrift were 10 women, wrapped in ragged blankets and deerskins, their faces gaunt from hunger, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. Their black hair was stiff with ice, their lips cracked and bleeding from the cold. They were Apache. He could tell from their dress, their beads, the high proud cheekbones that even suffering could not erase. For a heartbeat, neither he nor they moved. Snow swirled between them like ghosts. Then the woman at the front, perhaps no older than 30, whispered through chattering teeth, "Please, a shelter." Elias's grip tightened on the rifle. Instinct screamed at him to shut the door, to keep his world closed as it had been for 3 decades. He had no room for strangers, and certainly not for 10 of them. But the sight of their hollow faces, their frostbitten hands clutching each other for warmth, pierced through the armor of solitude he had built around his heart. He cursed under his breath. "Get in," he growled, pulling the door wider. One by one, they stumbled inside, stamping snow from their feet, clutching one another like lost children. The warmth of the fire hit them, and steam rose from their clothes. They crowded the small space, filling it with the scent of damp earth and smoke. Their eyes darted about the cabin, wary but desperate. Elias shut the door against the storm and leaned the rifle back against the wall. For a moment, the only sound was the hiss of the fire and the ragged breathing of the women. He turned, his voice rough. "What in God's name are you doing out in this?" The leader, the one who had spoken, stepped forward. She held herself tall despite the tremor in her limbs. Her name, she said, was Neche, which meant owl in her tongue. Her words came slow, broken with exhaustion, but Elias understood enough. They had been cast out, exiled from their people. For what reason she did not say, only that their chief had banished them beyond the mountains. They had wandered for weeks, hunted by wolves, half-starved, with nowhere left to go. "Nowhere," Nature repeated, pointing at the door, then shaking her head. Her dark eyes locked with Elias's, pleading but proud. "Shelter, one night, or we die." Elias stood silent for a long while, his jaw tight. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. 10 extra mouths in the dead of winter meant more wood to chop, more food to find, more risk at every turn. Yet the thought of turning them back out into the storm was something he could not bring himself to do. Finally, he nodded once. One night, the women exhaled, relief softening their faces. They sank down near the fire, stretching out numb hands toward the flames. Elias fetched his iron pot, filled it with venison stew from a crock near the hearth, and ladled out what he had. They devoured it in silence, eyes shining with gratitude though no words were spoken. Elias sat back in his chair watching them. For 30 years he had lived alone with nothing but his own silence for company. Now his cabin was filled with 10 strangers whose presence stirred memories he thought long buried. He didn't know it yet, but the long lonely winters of Elias McGraw were over. The storm passed by dawn, leaving the world outside Elias McGraw's cabin buried beneath drifts taller than a man on horseback. The pines bowed under the weight of snow, their branches groaning in the silence. Smoke curled from the chimney, the only sign of life for miles around. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke, venison fat, and damp hides slowly drying by the fire. The Apache women slept in a cluster near the hearth, huddled together beneath blankets. Their breathing was steady, their faces finally softened by rest instead of carved tight with desperation. Elias hadn't slept much. He sat in his chair, boots planted on the plank floor, his Winchester across his lap. Old habits died hard, and a man who had lived alone for 30 winters did not close both eyes easily, not when strangers shared his roof. Yet in the flickering firelight he found himself studying them. 10 exiles, each with a story they hadn't spoken aloud. When dawn broke gray and cold, nature stirred first. She sat up, her dark eyes meeting Elias's. No words passed between them, only a nod of mutual acknowledgement. He rose, stretched the stiffness from his shoulders, and went to the door. The cold bit his skin as he stepped outside. The air was sharp, clear, and heavy with the weight of snow. He scanned the horizon. Habit, instinct, maybe paranoia out here. A man survived by seeing danger before it arrived. The land looked quiet, but quiet in the wilderness was never trustable. By mid-morning, the women were awake, their hunger sharp again. Elias split what remained of the dried meat and jerky between them, though his supplies were thinning fast. 10 mouths would burn through his stores in days. If they stayed, survival would demand more than stew and goodwill. When they finished, he cleared his throat. His voice came low, gravelly from years of disuse. You stay here, you work. That's the rule. Chop wood, carry water. Hunt if you can. I ain't running a charity. Nature translated for the others, her tone firm. To his surprise, none balked. Some nodded. One young woman, no more than 17, lifted an axe unsteadily, testing its weight. Elias almost chuckled. The sight of a girl half his size squaring herself against a log was something. But she swung true, and the crack of splitting wood rang sharp in the frozen air. So the day began. Elias showed them how to gather pine boughs for kindling, how to set rabbit snares, how to carry snow in buckets to melt for water. Their hands were raw, their movements clumsy, but they learned fast. Necessity had a way of teaching quicker than any man's words. By dusk, a small pile of split logs sat by the cabin, and the snares held 2 scrawny rabbits. Not much, but a beginning. That night, around the fire, Elias caught fragments of their speech. Whispers of fear, of the past they had fled. Though nature spoke little of it, he pieced together enough. They had been cast out not for crime, but for defiance. They had refused to bow to the will of a chief who sought to use them as bargaining pieces in war. Exile was their punishment, and death their likely fate. Elias understood exile. He had lived it, though it had been self-imposed. He said nothing, but for the first time in 30 winters, the silence in his cabin did not feel like a curse. 2 weeks passed. Life settled into rhythm. Hard, grinding, necessary. Elias taught them to shoot, starting with the old Spencer rifle and the Colt he kept wrapped in oiled cloth. Their hands trembled at first, but the crack of gunfire soon steadied them. He showed them how to track deer through the snow, how to watch for wolf sign, how to move quiet through the trees. The women gave back what they could. They stitched his torn buckskins with skill, their needles finer than his clumsy hands had ever managed. They wove mats from dried reeds to line the cabin floor, making it warmer than it had been in years. And at night, when Elias sat sharpening his knife, they sometimes sang low in their tongue, haunting songs of rivers and fire, carrying sorrow and strength both. But peace never lasted long on the frontier. One morning, as Elias checked his traps along the ridge, he found sign in the snow: tracks. Not deer, not elk, horses. 4, maybe 5, shod heavy, men's boots pressed deep nearby. They weren't his. They weren't Apache. Outlaws, more likely. He crouched, fingers brushing the frozen print, his jaw clenched. He had seen tracks like these before, long ago, on the day he had buried his wife and son. That evening, he told Nachi. She stiffened, her eyes narrowing like a hawk's. White men? She asked, her English rough. Could be, Elias muttered. Could be worse. They doubled the watch that night. The women took turns with the rifle, though Elias stayed awake longer than any of them. He sat by the window slit, eyes on the tree line, listening for the sound of hooves. 3 nights later, the trouble came. The sound of horses carried through the still night air, faint but certain. Elias woke the women with a whisper. Nature gripped his arm, eyes burning with fear and fire. The riders did not come close at first. They circled, their silhouettes black against the moonlit snow. Elias counted 6, maybe 7. He heard the faint jingle of spurs, the low bark of laughter outlaws. He knew the type scavengers who would burn a cabin just to see what spilled out. The women crouched low, clutching their rifles, breathing hard. Elias felt his old blood stir, the same cold fire that had once driven him when he rode with a rifle across the plains, hunting the men who had butchered his kin. But this time he was not alone. The riders reined in at the tree line, calling out, "Old man! We know you're in there. Heard tell you're keeping a harem of redskins to yourself. Figure that's worth a look." Their laughter cut through the night like blades. Elias's jaw tightened. He raised his Winchester, sighting through the narrow slit of the window. "Stay quiet," he murmured to the women. The outlaw's voice rang again, dripping with mockery. "Ain't no sense keepin' him hid. Send him out, we'll make it quick." Elias fired. The shot cracked like thunder. One rider tumbled from his saddle, his scream cut short by snow. The horses spooked, rearing. The others cursed, firing wildly toward the cabin. Bullets smacked into the logs, splinters flying. The women screamed, but nature barked orders sharp as a whip. They took positions, rifles braced. Elias racked another round and fired again. Another outlaw fell, rolling in the snow. The fight for the cabin had begun.